You're not getting anything, Mrs. Collins, the lawyer said, his voice careful but firm. And neither are they. I didn't react. I didn't need to. I had already watched it happen in my mind 100 times before this moment ever arrived. Daniel's chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor as he stood up too fast, his face pale, confusion flickering into something sharper, something desperate. That's not possible, he said, looking between the lawyer and me like there had to be a mistake someone would fix if he just waited long enough. Sophia didn't speak at first. She just stared at the folder in front of her, her manicured fingers frozen against the paper as if touching it might somehow change what it said. For a brief second, I almost saw the girl I once welcomed into my home. Almost. But then she looked up, and the calculation was back. Always calculation. There must be another document, she said, her tone controlled, polite, rehearsed. Margaret wouldn't do something like this without telling us. I finally lifted my eyes to meet hers. Not angry. Not hurt. Just steady. You're right, I said quietly. I didn't tell you. The room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock behind me. Each second landed heavier than the last. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing now, the way he used to when he was a teenager trying to explain away a bad decision. Only this time, there was no explanation that could fix anything. Mom, he said, and there it was, that word he hadn't used sincerely in years. This doesn't make sense. You said everything would stay in the family? I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because I remembered when I used to believe that word meant something. Family. It did stay in the family, I replied. Just not the one you chose. Sophia's composure cracked then, just slightly, a tightening around her mouth, a flicker of something colder beneath her eyes. This is a misunderstanding, she insisted. We've been taking care of you. We've been helping you manage everything. Helping. That word echoed in my mind, hollow and familiar. I didn't correct her. I didn't argue. I simply folded my hands in my lap and let the silence do the work for me. The lawyer cleared his throat, sliding the documents back into place with careful precision. The terms are very clear, he said. All assets have been reassigned according to Mrs. Collins' final directives. Final. Such a simple word. Such a permanent one. Daniel stopped pacing. Reassigned to who? He asked, his voice lower now, cautious, like he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. I leaned back slightly in my chair, feeling a strange calm settle over me, the kind that only comes after something long overdue has finally happened. That part, I said, isn't your concern anymore. The look on his face then, shock, betrayal, disbelief, it might have hurt me once. Years ago, I would have reached for him, tried to explain, tried to fix what he felt. But now I simply watched. Because the truth was, this moment didn't start here. It didn't start in this office, or with these papers, or even with that question. It started long before any of them realized. It started the day I understood exactly what I meant to them. And more importantly, what I didn't. And by the time they figured it out, it was already too late. 72 hours earlier, the house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, like something had already been decided without me being invited into the room where it happened, and I remember standing in the kitchen with my hand resting on the edge of the counter, staring at the coffee I had poured but never drank, because even then something felt off, something I could not quite name yet, but it was there. Sitting heavy in my chest like a truth waiting to be acknowledged, and when Daniel walked in that morning he did not look at me the way he used to, there was no warmth, no pause, just a quick glance before he reached for his keys, already halfway out the door before he even said good morning, and I noticed it, I noticed everything, the way he avoided eye contact, the way his voice sounded rehearsed when he asked if I needed anything, the way he did not wait for an answer, and Sophia followed a few minutes later. Perfectly put together as always, her smile polished, her tone light. But her eyes were already somewhere else, calculating, measuring, deciding, and she asked me if I had thought more about simplifying things. about making life easier for myself, and I nodded slowly as if I had not heard those same words before, as if I did not already understand what she meant by easier, because easier never meant easier for me, it meant easier for them. And I let the silence stretch between us just long enough for her to fill it, just long enough for her to believe she was leading the conversation, guiding me towards something I had not already chosen, and that was when I realized something important, something that changed everything, because it was not just what they were saying, it was what they had already decided without me, the quiet shifts, the small exclusions, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the documents left just slightly out of place as if they forgot I might still notice. And I did notice. I noticed the new account statements, the unfamiliar names, the subtle changes in how bills were discussed, how decisions were framed, always presented as if they were helping me, always wrapped in concern, but underneath it all there was something colder, something deliberate, and that morning when Sophia suggested we meet with the lawyer again to review everything, to make sure everything was in order, I smiled and agreed. Because by then I understood that this was not about helping me at all, this was about positioning themselves for something they believed was already theirs, and I remember walking back to my room after they left, closing the door gently behind me, and sitting down on the edge of the bed where I had spent so many years building a life I thought would always include them, and I looked around at the photographs, the memories carefully arranged on every surface, and for the first time I saw them differently, not as proof of love, but as reminders of something that had quietly changed without my permission, and I did not cry. I did not react, I simply sat there and let the realization settle in, because once you see it clearly, once you understand that you are no longer being valued for who you are but for what you have, there is a kind of calm that follows, a clarity that strips away everything unnecessary, and in that moment I made a decision, not out of anger, not out of hurt, but out of understanding, because they had already chosen what mattered to them, and all that was left for me was to decide what mattered to me, and how I would respond, and by the time I stood up from that bed, the plan had already begun to take shape. Quiet, precise, and completely invisible to the two people who believed they were already in control. The dinner that night felt carefully arranged, not for comfort but for performance, and I noticed how everything was set just a little too perfectly, the table aligned, the candles placed at equal distance, the plates positioned as if someone wanted the scene to look a certain way. And Sophia moved around the room with that same controlled energy, adjusting small things that did not need adjusting, smoothing invisible wrinkles, straightening already straight edges, while Daniel sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence except for a brief nod when I took my seat across from him. And I realized then that this was not just dinner, this was a setup, something had already been decided and tonight was simply the moment they planned to present it. And I folded my hands in my lap and waited, because waiting had become something I was very good at, and when Sophia finally sat down, she did not reach for her glass or her fork, she simply looked at Daniel for a brief second, a silent signal, and that was all it took. He cleared his throat and placed his phone face down on the table as if that small gesture meant he was fully present, but his eyes still avoided mine, and then he said it, not directly, not clearly, but carefully shaped, like someone repeating words they had practiced more than once. He said that they had been thinking about the future, about making sure everything was organized, about reducing stress for everyone involved, and I listened without interrupting, without reacting, because I already knew where this was going, and Sophia leaned forward slightly, her voice softer but sharper underneath. And she said that managing finances at my age could become overwhelming, that it might be better if Daniel took a more active role, that it would give me peace of mind knowing everything was handled properly. And I noticed the way she said properly, the way she emphasized it just enough to suggest that something was currently not, and I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it confirmed everything I had already seen. And I let a small silence settle before answering, just long enough to make them wonder if I had understood, and then I nodded slowly and said that I had been thinking about that too, and the shift in the room was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Daniel leaned back slightly as if a weight had lifted, Sophia's shoulders relaxed just enough to reveal satisfaction, and for the first time that evening they both looked at me directly, not with warmth, not with concern, but with something closer to relief, as if I had just made things easier for them, and that was when I understood the full shape of it. This was not about helping me, this was about gaining control without resistance, about making it seem like my idea so they would not have to confront what they were actually doing, and I continued to play my part, asking simple questions, agreeing where it made sense, allowing them to explain their plan in detail, how accounts would be consolidated, how responsibilities would shift, how everything would be streamlined, and each word they spoke revealed more than they realized, because beneath the careful language there was urgency, beneath the concern there was expectation, and beneath it all there was the quiet certainty that I would simply accept it, that I would not question it, that I would not look too closely, and I let them believe that. I let them finish. I let the conversation reach its natural conclusion where they both felt comfortable, even confident. And when Daniel finally asked if I was okay with moving forward, I met his eyes for a brief moment, just long enough for him to see calm instead of resistance, and I said yes, and that single word sealed everything, because in that moment they thought they had won something. They thought the decision was made, but what they did not understand was that I had already made mine long before they sat down at that table, and from that point on, everything they saw was exactly what I wanted them to see. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because there was a clarity in my mind that had not been there before, a kind of quiet awareness that made everything feel sharper, more defined, and as I walked through the house I had lived in for over 30 years, I began to see it differently, not as a place filled with shared memories, but as a space that had slowly been taken from me piece by piece without a single argument, without a single raised voice, just small decisions made in quiet moments that I had once dismissed as insignificant. And I paused in the living room, my eyes resting on the framed photograph of Daniel as a child, sitting on the front steps with a gap in his smile and dirt on his knees, looking up at me like I was the center of his world, and for a moment I let that memory exist, not with pain, but with distance. Because the boy in that photograph and the man who sat across from me at dinner the night before were no longer the same person, and perhaps they had not been for a long time. I had just chosen not to see it. And that realization did not break me, it steadied me, because it meant that what I was about to do was not betrayal, it was recognition, and I moved into the kitchen, making my coffee the same way I always had, measuring each step with precision, not out of habit, but because routine has a way of grounding you when everything else shifts. And as I sat down at the table, I noticed a folder placed neatly near the center, one I had not left there, and I did not need to open it to know what it contained. But I did anyway, slowly, carefully, reading through the printed pages with the same calm I had shown the night before, and there it was, outlined in polite language and structured sentences, the transfer of authority, the consolidation of accounts, the reassignment of control. All presented as if it were a natural progression, as if it were something that benefited everyone equally. But every line carried the same quiet message, that I was no longer trusted to manage what I had built, that my role had shifted from owner to dependent, and I closed the folder gently, placing it back exactly where I found it, because there was no need to disturb anything yet. Not when everything was already moving exactly as I needed it to, and later that afternoon, when Sophia returned home, she greeted me with the same practiced warmth, asking if I had a chance to review the documents, her tone light, almost casual, but her eyes watching closely for any sign of hesitation, any sign that I might question what had been placed in front of me, and I met her gaze without resistance, without suspicion, and I told her that everything looked fine, that I appreciated how thorough it was, and I saw it then. The flicker of satisfaction she tried to hide, the subtle shift in her posture. As if she had just confirmed something important, and Daniel joined us shortly after, asking the same question in a different way, his voice careful, almost hopeful, and I gave him the same answer, steady, uncomplicated, and in that moment they both believed the hardest part was over, that the transition would be smooth, that I had accepted my place in their version of the future, and I let them believe that. Because belief can be more powerful than any document, more binding than any signature. And as the evening settled in and the house returned to its usual quiet rhythm, I sat alone once more, not with uncertainty, but with intention, because while they were preparing to take control, I was preparing to redefine it entirely, and the difference between those two things was something they would not understand until it was far too late. I left the house the next morning at exactly 9:15, the same time I had left every Tuesday for years, except this time I was not going to the grocery store or the pharmacy or any of the small errands that once filled my days. This time I was going somewhere that Daniel and Sophia did not know about, somewhere they had never needed to consider. Because in their minds everything that mattered was already within their reach, and as I drove through the familiar streets, I kept my hand steady on the wheel, not because I was nervous, but because I understood the importance of what I was about to do, the precision it required, the silence it depended on, and when I pulled into the parking lot of the small brick building on the corner of Maple and 3rd, I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror, not searching for reassurance, but confirming something I already knew, that I was ready, and when I stepped inside, the air felt different, quieter, more deliberate, as if even the walls understood that decisions made here carried weight beyond the moment, and the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile before asking my name, and when I told her, there was a brief pause, just enough to suggest recognition, before she nodded and asked me to take a seat, and I did, folding my hands in my lap the same way I had the night before, calm, composed, waiting, and within minutes the door opened and Mr. Reynolds stepped out, his expression measured but not surprised, as if he had been expecting this visit long before I made it, and he invited me into his office, closing the door gently behind us, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because some conversations do not need to begin with words. They begin with understanding, and he finally asked how he could help me, and I placed my purse on the desk, opening it slowly, not searching for anything, but creating space, and I told him that I needed to make changes, not small adjustments or temporary arrangements, but permanent decisions, ones that would define what happened next, and he listened without interrupting, his hands resting on the desk, his eyes steady, and when I finished speaking, he did not ask why, he did not question my reasoning. He simply nodded once and reached for a folder, because sometimes the absence of questions is the clearest form of respect, and as he began outlining the process, explaining the steps in precise, careful language, I followed every detail, not because it was complicated, but because it mattered. Every account, every asset, every piece of what I had spent a lifetime building was being repositioned, not taken away, not hidden, but placed exactly where it could no longer be assumed, and I signed where I needed to sign, slowly, deliberately, my hand steady with each line, not rushed, not hesitant, because this was not an emotional decision, it was a necessary one, and when it was done, when the final document was placed back into the folder and set aside, Mr. Reynolds looked at me for a moment longer than before, as if acknowledging something unspoken, and he said that everything was now secure, that the terms were clear, that there would be no confusion later, and I nodded, because clarity was exactly what I wanted, not for myself, but for them, and as I stood to leave, he asked if there was anything else I needed, and I shook my head, because everything that mattered had already been done. And when I stepped back outside, the sunlight felt warmer than it had that morning, not because anything had changed in the world around me, but because something had shifted within me, something quiet but final, and as I drove home, I allowed myself one brief thought, not of regret, not of doubt, but of understanding, because they believed they were preparing for a future where they controlled everything, but what they did not realize was that future no longer existed, not in the way they imagined. And by the time I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I was already back in place, already the version of myself they expected to see, calm, agreeable, unaware, and when I walked through the front door, I greeted them the same way I always had, with a small smile and a steady voice, because sometimes the most important part of any plan is not what you do, but what you allow others to believe you have not done. The following days unfolded exactly the way I expected them to, quiet on the surface, almost peaceful if you did not know where to look, and that was the part that fascinated me the most, how easily normalcy could be maintained when everyone believed the outcome was already decided, and Daniel began to take small steps, subtle at first, offering to handle a bill here, asking for account details there, always phrased as a question but never really waiting for an answer, and I gave him just enough access, just enough information to keep the illusion intact, because control is not something you seize all at once, it is something you ease into, something you believe you are earning, and Sophia was even more careful, more precise. She did not ask directly. She guided, she suggested, she created situations where the conclusion felt inevitable, and I watched her closely, not with resentment, but with clarity, noticing the patterns, the repetition, the way she framed every conversation around what was best for everyone while subtly shifting everything in her favor. And one evening, as we sat in the living room, she brought up the idea of finalizing everything, making it official, her tone calm but her eyes alert, waiting for any sign of hesitation, and Daniel agreed quickly, almost too quickly, as if he had been waiting for her to say it first, and I listened, nodding at the right moments, asking a few simple questions that made me appear cautious but not resistant, because hesitation would have slowed them down, and I did not want that. I wanted them to move forward, to believe that everything was aligning exactly as they had planned, and when Sophia placed the final set of documents in front of me a few days later, she did it with a kind of quiet confidence, the kind that comes from believing there is no longer any risk, and I picked them up slowly, reading through each page with the same calm attention I had shown before, not skipping, not rushing, because details matter, even when you already know how the story ends. And Daniel watched me the entire time, his hands clasped together, his posture tense, waiting for the moment I would either agree or push back, and I could see it in his eyes, the expectation. The assumption that I would eventually say yes, because I always had, because for years that had been my role, to support, to trust, to give without question, and I let that history work in their favor. I let it carry the weight of this moment, and when I finally set the papers down, I looked at both of them, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with a steady calm that they interpreted as acceptance, and I said that it seemed reasonable, that I understood their concerns, that I appreciated their efforts to make things easier, and the relief that followed was immediate, visible, almost tangible. Sophia's shoulders relaxed. Daniel exhaled in a way that suggested he had been holding his breath for longer than he realized, and in that moment they both believed the hardest part was behind them, that the transition was complete, that everything now belonged where it should, and I signed, slowly, deliberately, my pen moving across each line with the same precision I had used just days before in a different office, and when it was done, Sophia carefully gathered the documents, aligning them perfectly before placing them back into the folder. Her movements controlled but her satisfaction undeniable, and Daniel thanked me, his voice softer now, almost warm, as if this single act had restored something between us, but I did not respond to that, because what he felt in that moment was not connection, it was relief that the outcome matched his expectations, and as the evening settled and the conversation shifted to lighter things, to ordinary topics that filled the space where something important had just occurred, I sat quietly, observing. Because everything had unfolded exactly as it needed to, every step, every word, every decision, and the most important part was not what they had gained, but what they believed they had secured. Because belief has a way of anchoring people to a version of reality that no longer exists, and by the time they realized that, there would be nothing left for them to hold on to. The house felt different after that night, not in a way that could be seen or touched, but in the way silence settled into the corners, in the way footsteps sounded slightly louder against the floor, as if even the walls were aware that something irreversible had already taken place, and Daniel moved through the rooms with a new kind of confidence, subtle but unmistakable, checking his phone more often, stepping outside to take calls he no longer bothered to explain, while Sophia became even more composed, her movements smoother, her tone softer, as if she no longer needed to prove anything because in her mind the outcome had already been secured, and I watched it all without interruption, without reaction, because observation had become more valuable than response, and one afternoon, as I passed by the hallway outside the study, I heard their voices. Low at first, then clearer as I paused just long enough to understand the shape of their conversation, and Sophia was speaking, her words precise, measured, discussing timelines, next steps, the idea of listing the house, not immediately, but soon, once everything was fully settled, and Daniel responded with hesitation, not disagreement, but concern about how it might look, how it might feel, and she reassured him quickly, explaining that it was practical, that it made sense financially, that it was the logical progression of what they had already started, and I stood there for a moment, not surprised, not even disappointed, just confirming what I had already known, that this was never about helping me stay comfortable, it was about repositioning everything in a way that benefited them, and I continued walking without making a sound, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to interpret, and later that evening, as we sat together in the living room, Daniel mentioned the idea casually, almost as if it had just occurred to him, talking about future plans, about possibilities, about making things more efficient, and I listened, nodding slightly, offering no resistance, because resistance would have required them to justify their intentions, and I had no interest in hearing explanations that no longer mattered, and Sophia added her thoughts carefully, reinforcing the same ideas, layering them with concern, with reason, with that familiar tone that made everything sound like it was being done for my benefit, and I met her gaze briefly, just long enough to acknowledge her words without challenging them, and in that moment she believed I had accepted it, that I had reached the same conclusion they had already decided on, and that belief was exactly what I needed them to hold on to, because the stronger their certainty, the less they would question what came next, and as the days continued, their conversations became more open, more direct, no longer whispered behind closed doors but spoken in front of me as if I were already outside of the decisions being made, and I allowed that distance to exist, I allowed them to move forward with their plans, to organize, to prepare, to believe that everything was unfolding exactly as they intended, because every step they took brought them closer to a moment they did not see coming, and the most important part of that process was not stopping them, not correcting them, but letting them continue without interruption, because sometimes the only way to reveal the truth is to let it fully develop, to let it reach a point where it can no longer be denied, and by the time they realized what they had built, it would already be too late to change it, too late to step back, too late to understand that what they thought they had secured was never truly theirs to begin with. The day of the final meeting arrived without announcement, without ceremony, just another quiet morning that looked exactly like the ones before it, and that was the part that made it so effective, because nothing about it felt significant until it was already too late to change anything, and Daniel mentioned it over breakfast as if it were a simple formality, a quick visit to confirm everything had been processed correctly. His tone casual, almost relaxed, while Sophia added that it would give everyone peace of mind, her voice smooth, controlled, the same way it had been from the beginning, and I nodded, finishing my coffee without comment, because there was nothing left to say, and the drive to the office was quiet, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled. Daniel focused on the road, Sophia occasionally checking her phone, and I sat in the back seat, looking out the window as familiar streets passed by. Not because I was distracted, but because I had already seen how this moment would unfold, and when we arrived, everything moved quickly, the receptionist greeting us, the same office, the same door closing behind us, but the atmosphere felt different now, heavier, more defined, as if the truth had already taken its place in the room before any of us sat down, and Mr. Reynolds entered with the same calm presence he always carried, acknowledging each of us with a polite nod before taking his seat, and Daniel spoke first, explaining that they were there to finalize everything, to ensure that the transfer had been completed, his words confident, structured, as if he had repeated them in his mind several times before saying them out loud, and Sophia sat beside him, composed, attentive, her posture perfect, her expression steady, the picture of certainty, and Mr. Reynolds listened without interruption, his hands resting on the desk, his eyes moving briefly toward me before returning to Daniel, and when he finally spoke, his tone was measured, careful, as if he understood that what he was about to say would shift something fundamental in the room, and he began by confirming that all documents had been processed, that all directives had been followed exactly as outlined, and I noticed the slight relaxation in Daniel's shoulders, the almost imperceptible exhale, the moment of relief that came from believing everything had gone according to plan, and then Mr. Reynolds continued, his voice steady. explaining that the assets in question were no longer under the control of any individual party, that they had been reassigned according to specific conditions that had already been met, and the shift in the room was immediate, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Daniel's posture stiffened, Sophia's expression tightened just enough to reveal the first crack in her composure, and there was a pause, a brief moment where either of them spoke, as if they were both waiting for the rest of the explanation to correct what they had just heard, but it did not, it only became clearer, more precise, as Mr. Reynolds outlined the structure, the limitations, the finality of the arrangement, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, cautious, asking for clarification, asking what exactly that meant, and Mr. Reynolds answered without hesitation, explaining that the assets were no longer accessible in the way they expected, that the authority they believed they had secured did not extend to what had already been placed beyond their reach, and I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, my gaze steady, because this was the moment everything became visible, not through confrontation, not through accusation, but through simple, undeniable facts, and Sophia spoke next. Her voice controlled but sharper underneath, questioning the validity of the arrangement, suggesting there must have been a misunderstanding, and Mr. Reynolds responded with the same calm certainty, referencing the signed documents, the dates, the terms that had been clearly established, and the room grew quieter with each word, heavier, as the reality they had constructed began to dissolve, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, and I watched them both, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, because this was not about taking something from them, it was about allowing them to see what had never truly been theirs, and by the time the conversation ended, by the time the final explanation had been given, there was nothing left to question, nothing left to reinterpret, only the quiet understanding that everything they had believed was now gone, replaced by something they could not change, and something I had already accepted long before we ever walked into that room. No one spoke as we left the office, not at first, not in the hallway, not in the elevator, not even when the doors opened and we stepped out into the bright afternoon light that felt strangely unchanged despite everything that had just happened, and Daniel walked ahead, his pace uneven, his shoulders tense in a way I had never seen before, while Sophia remained perfectly composed on the surface, her posture straight, her expression controlled, but there was something different now, something fractured beneath the calm, and I followed behind them without urgency, without hesitation, because there was nowhere I needed to rush to anymore, nothing left to prove, and when we reached the car, Daniel turned to me, his face searching for something he could still hold on to, some version of this moment that made sense to him, and he asked me why, his voice quieter than I expected, not angry, not demanding, just uncertain, and I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, not as the boy I once knew, but as the man standing in front of me now, and I realized that there was nothing I could say that would change what he had already chosen to believe, so I answered simply, telling him that I had done what I needed to do, and that was the truth, even if it was not the explanation he wanted, and Sophia spoke then, her voice measured but sharper than before, asking how I could make such a decision without involving them, without trusting them, and I met her gaze steadily, because trust is not something you explain, it is something that either exists or it does not, and in that moment there was no reason to pretend otherwise. And I told her that everything I had done was based on what I had seen, on what I had understood, and that was enough, and neither of them responded immediately, because sometimes the simplest answers leave the least room for argument, and the drive home was quieter than before, not just in sound, but in presence, as if the space between us had finally been acknowledged instead of ignored, and when we pulled into the driveway, Daniel sat there for a moment longer than necessary, his hands still on the steering wheel, as if he was trying to gather something he had lost without realizing it until now, and I opened the door without waiting, stepping out into the familiar space that no longer felt the same, and I walked inside slowly, not because I was tired, but because I understood that this would be the last time I entered this house as it had always been, and I moved through each room with quiet awareness, not stopping, not lingering, just seeing it clearly for what it was, a place that had once been filled with shared meaning, now reduced to something else entirely. And later that evening, as I gathered a few things into a single bag, Nothing more than what I needed. Daniel stood in the doorway watching me, not speaking, not stopping me, just standing there as if he was waiting for me to change my mind, and I did not, because there was nothing left to reconsider, and when I finally walked past him, he said my name, softly, almost like a question, and I paused just long enough to acknowledge that I had heard him, but not long enough to turn around, because some moments do not need to be revisited, they only need to be understood, and as I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me, I felt something I had not expected, not sadness, not regret, but a kind of quiet relief, the kind that comes when something that has been unspoken for too long is finally brought into the light, and as I walked away, I did not look back, not because I could not, but because I no longer needed to, because in the end, they had made their choice, and I had made mine, and the difference between those two choices was something they would carry long after I was gone, because they did not lose me in that moment. They lost something far greater, something they had never truly valued until it was no longer there.